All right, so this is going to be the last video on Billy Budd. We've wrapped it up in class. We've touched on pretty much the most salient points in the novella. So this is going to be more of a review and focusing in on the particulars in the last chapters, which really brings everything together in so many ways. Again, we want to, and again, most of this will be review for you. You've been in class, you've been attentive, taking notes, etc. But a reminder that we have this shift in this latter part of the novella, shift of sorts, where the focus really starts to be on Captain Vere. Right, so we've had this build-up with the confrontation. Remember, we've talked a lot about all the different conflicts that are in play in this novella, good versus evil, the individual versus society, etc. And of course, we've had a major representation of this conflict in the conflict between Billy and Claggart, which comes to a head in the confrontation between the two, when Captain Vere seeks out Billy to bring him into the discussion after Claggart makes his accusations so that Billy can face his accuser face to face. We know what transpires. Billy, in his sense of outrage, I suppose, partly, among other things, is unable to speak because of his stutter and communicates in the only way that he can, given his inability to speak, by lashing out. And in the process of lashing out, he hits Claggart in the forehead and kills him. So what we have there at this point, at this juncture in the story, is one of our three main characters, Claggart, is dead. Billy is incarcerated. And now the focus on Captain Vere revolves around the decision that Captain Vere makes, though he doesn't make it alone. It's important to remember that. Vere does not act as a tyrant and makes a decision that this is what we're going to do and we're going to hang Billy. He calls for a trial. He follows procedure. Remember, Captain Vere is very much by the book. And his whole argument in his discussions with the three members of that court who are hesitant to carry out the execution of Billy or to even have the trial, suggesting that they return to the fleet. Remember, they're separated from the fleet at this point. They are on their own. Vere's argument, compelling at times, is rooted in procedure and rooted in law, martial law, law that is in place in this military environment. It's important to remember that because of the environment, because of the situation they're in, Vere's argument becomes more compelling and seemingly quite rational. And of course, it's troubling, and it's arguably meant to be, because even with Captain Vere, no one is doubting what happened, that Billy killed Claggart. That's a fact that everyone agrees occurred. It's about what kind of consideration should be given to the circumstances of this event. And we certainly get a sense from the other members of the court that those circumstances should be taken into account. If nothing else, let's wait until we get back to the fleet and, you know, talk to the admiral and see if we can't have a trial, because there has to be a hearing, there has to be a trial, but one that might be able to incorporate the circumstances in a way that is, in their minds, and arguably in our minds as well, is what would lead to a fair and just conclusion. We're very much asked to contemplate whether or not justice is served here in executing Billy. And we've had some lively discussions in class on this matter, which again is what we're supposed to be doing. We're not given a clear-cut, absolute indication as to whether this was right or wrong. We're asked to draw our own conclusions, but we are given this very compelling argument on the part of Captain Vere. Captain Vere, who has in his mind very much befriended Billy, right? He was thinking of having Billy promoted. He knows that Billy has had a wonderful impact on the crew. Everyone loves baby Billy. Also explains why he doesn't believe Claggart. So, and remember that he is immediately suspicious of Claggart with Claggart's accusations. And we're expected to trust Captain Vere's assessment of things. Why are we expected to trust Vere's assessment? Because we've been informed of his character, his learning, his bookishness, his interest in philosophy, but also that he has proven himself to be a capable and exceptionally good captain, not just in terms of following procedures and knowing how to operate as a commander a 74-gun ship in battle, but also that he understands his men, right? That's emphasized to us, that he is not incapable of sympathy and empathy for his men. And that's an important quality that he has as a captain in the environment with the mutinies recently having transpired. The fact that he is someone who cares about his men really elevates him to a large degree as a captain. Again, in a world where often that caring by the commanding, by the elite, for the average man, manning the cannon, etc., is not usually there. And of course, that really comes into play when we see how much he seemingly, in terms of his behavior, cares about Billy. Remember his frustration when Billy starts to stutter, and Captain Vere saying, "Speak up, man, defend yourself. I brought you here to confront your accuser so that you can defend yourself." And then when he recognizes that Billy is stuttering, his tone shifts dramatically. He says, okay, take your time. I'm gonna take your time. But Billy can't, right? So this focus, this shift of focus onto Vere becomes paramount in terms of how we view everything that transpires after the death of Claggart. So let's look at the text. Again, I'm not going to make this too long, because I learned the hard way that no one wants to watch long videos. But in preparation for your exam, we need to review these things so that you have the opportunity to come back to them and be better prepared, hopefully. So I just wanted to, I'm going to jump around quite a bit here because we can't go through it line by line. But note here, one thing that I want to draw your attention to in chapter 22 is what's in terms of this martial code that they have to adhere to given their environment. In the jugglery of circumstances preceding and attending the event on board the Indomitable, and in light of that martial code whereby it was formally to be judged, it's an interesting observation here. Innocence and guilt, personified in Claggart and Budd, in effect changes places. Right? So remember all the emphasis we've seen on this element of innocence in Billy Budd. And the guilt or the evil, bad, malicious behavior and thought of Claggart that we've been subject to right up to this point is inversed in this martial code, martial law. Billy is now no longer innocent. He is guilty of killing a superior officer. That's a fact. And Claggart, who has been manipulating, his down on Billy to an extraordinary level in terms of bringing him up these charges and accusations against him, has now become the victim. And now arguably has become innocent because, you know, innocent in the sense that he didn't deserve to die, right? It was certainly not the intent on anyone's part. And if he has accusations, you need to show the evidence. Remember, Claggart says, I have the evidence. The evidence is close at hand. We never get to see that evidence. Veer never gets to see the evidence. Billy never gets to see the evidence because everything surrounding the behavior of Claggart in terms of trying to destroy Billy Budd is no longer relevant in this martial law, martial code environment. The only thing now to deal with is the fact that Billy killed a superior officer. And yes, we are meant to say, well, wait a minute. Given the circumstances and everything else, and that Claggart was out to get him and all this, shouldn't that still be relevant? And shouldn't that be relevant and be considered when passing judgment on Billy? And we have the other members of the court who are suggesting that. And I would argue that we're thinking the same thing to a large extent. And it's Captain Veer, seemingly the most rational and compassionate person here, argues against it. Now, there are other circumstances that drive Veer's decisions and arguments, right? It's, and we'll talk in a little more detail in a minute about the law and the details of the law and adhering to those details. But of course, there's also the fact of the mutinies, the danger of word getting out, of the sailors having too much time to think about what's happening, why did Billy do this, that the danger there is they will become restless, they will start thinking about, well, is this just? Is this the right thing? This is Billy after all. That the potential for an insurrectionist mentality developing among the crew is something that Captain Vere is conscious of and very much determined not to let happen. That explains the speed in which he moves to resolve this. And his argument on that level is we can't give the men, the crew, too much time to think about things, because then we may have a mutiny on our hands, especially given the relationship that Billy had with pretty much all these men. When they're interviewing Billy, and do note at this point how Billy is quite articulate, right? We talked about this in class. So Vere relates as the only witness everything that transpired. The first lieutenant, taking judicial primacy and turning towards the prisoner, said, "Captain Vere has spoken. Is it or is it not as Captain Vere says?" In response came Sybil's not so much impeded, talked about this in class. In response came Sybil's not so much impeded in the utterance as might have been anticipated, right? There is no stuttering here. Billy is articulate. And the narrator is suggesting to us that, we should be surprised by this, because Billy should be upset, agitated. And that's when he stutters. And these were the lines that Billy said. "Captain Vere tells the truth. It is just as Captain Vere says. But it is not as the master at arms said. I have eaten the king's bread, and I am true to the king." I'm going over this again because I think we only talked about it in detail in one of the two sections of this class. So I want the other section to draw their attention to this. Billy is articulate, and actually as articulate as we ever see him. The way that he expresses his loyalty to the king, the way he expresses his attitude very much in opposition to any kind of mutinous thinking, is in these lines: "I've eaten the king's bread and I am true to the king." That's not a simple way of saying that. It's very articulate. "I believe you, my man," is the response. So Billy is saying what Captain Vere relates here is absolutely true. I hit Claggart and I killed him. What is not true is the accusations that Claggart made against him. But of course, that's not what he is going to be going on trial for. The court is not trying to determine whether Billy had any mutinous intent, as Claggart was accusing him of. It is solely and exclusively about the death of Claggart. "God will bless you for that, Your Honor," "not without stammering," said Billy, and all but broke down. So even though he is agitated at this point, his stuttering is not playing a role. He regains his self-control, to which the same emotional difficulty of utterance, he said, "No, there was no malice between us." He's talking about his relationship with Claggart. "I never bore malice against the master at arms. I'm sorry that he is dead. I did not mean to kill him. Could I have used my tongue, I would not have struck him." This is his defense. "But he foully lied to my face and in presence of my captain, and I had to say something, and I can only say it with a blow. God help me." Now, I'm emphasizing this because we are asking ourselves, as we would expect the court, is this a good defense? And if this is the case, and Billy is being honest, which he is, and they certainly sense that he is, if this is what transpired, if as it is, should that not be taken into consideration? There was no malice. There is regret. There was no intent. Should that still remain a capital offense? Should the punishment for this still be death? And of course, only a court can decide that. But is this the proper place to have that court hearing, or should it be back with the fleet when more entities can be involved in assessing the situation? But you want to remember this as being essential insofar as it is Billy's defense. And it's compelling. We have here again, right? One more question, said the officer of Marines, now first speaking with troubled earnestness. You tell us that what the master at arms said against you was a lie. Now, why should he have so lied, so maliciously lied, since you declare there was no malice between you? Well, that's the question we're asking. And we see here, and certainly we're thinking, that it is relevant to Billy's actions. Can we separate what Claggart was doing to Billy? Can we remove that from what ultimately is Billy's act of killing Claggart? Can you look, in other words, can you look and assess all the implications and all the ideas revolving around justice and law and everything else in concerning Billy's killing of Claggart without taking into account what Claggart was doing to Billy? Because if you do take it into account, these are mitigating circumstances that really, in terms of morality, ethics, justice, would seem to be necessary in order to make a final assessment. And that's emphasized to us in these pages here. Vere argues against that. Captain Vere, who had been seated for a time, rose to his feet, addressing the interrogator. The question you put to him comes naturally enough. Remember, all the emphasis on natural behavior, one's true nature. The question you put is a natural one. Understandable why you would ask that. But how can he rightly answer it? Or anybody else? Unless it indeed be he who lies within there, designating the compartment where lay the corpse, where Claggart's body is. It's natural enough to ask these questions about why would Claggart do this and how that impacts Billy's behavior, but we can't answer it. The only answers to these questions lie dead with Claggart's dead body. In effect, he goes on, that, though, as it seems to me, the point you make is hardly material. Quite aside from any conceivable motive actuating the master at arms, and irrespective of the provocation to the blow. Excuse me. A martial court must needs, in the present case, confine its attention to the blow's consequence, which consequence justly is to be deemed not otherwise than as the striker's deed. Right? This is almost like a it sounds like he's reading out of a law book. right? It has that element to it, which consequence justly is to be deemed not otherwise than as the striker's deed. All that we are going to proceed to assess is the deed that Billy did, which was strike a superior officer. This utterance, the full significance of which it was not at all likely that Billy took in. And so again, narrator reminded us that Billy's may not understand all this legalese, this legal speak that's being put forth. Nevertheless, caused him to turn a wistful, interrogative look towards the speaker, a look in its dumb expressiveness, not unlike that which a dog of a generous breed might turn upon his master, seeking in his face some elucidation of a previous gesture ambiguous to the canine intelligence. Billy is looking over at Captain Vere, we're told here, as in the same manner in which a dog would be looking at his master, seeking something, looking for something in the master's face that would help him understand, the dog, to understand what's going on because of the reduced intelligence of the dog. Billy's being compared to a dog here, and Vere as his master. It's an interesting analogy. Billy's not really, seemingly not understanding what, or the significance of what Captain Vere just said. The other members of the court do. And they know that if they follow the rule of law exclusively and only deal with the facts as they know it and ignore those circumstances of Claggart, the circumstances pertaining to Claggart's accusations, that there is only one path they can follow. The soldier once more spoke in a tone of suggestive dubiety, addressing at once his associates and Captain Vere. Nobody is present. None of the ship's company, I mean, who might shed lateral light, if any is to be had, upon what remains mysterious in this matter. There's a lot here that is mysterious, is what the soldier, this is one of the court members of the court, is saying. That is mysterious, that we don't have answers to. And nobody is present who can shed light upon this mystery as to why Claggart was making his accusations. Note Captain Vere's response. That is thoughtfully put, said Captain Vere. I see your drift. I understand what you're saying. Aye, there is a mystery. But to use scriptural phrase, it is a mystery of iniquity, a matter for psychological theologians to discuss. Right? It's one of those, this is really gets at the crux of much of what we've been discussing about this novella. Remember that mystery, those things that we don't have answers to, that are not 2 + 2 = 4. Well, that's where mythology and religion and theology come into play to try to address those types of mysterious elements of the human condition, the ones that cannot be explained by science. That is the realm of art and theology and psychology, to try to understand it, approaching it theoretically, recognizing that we won't arrive at absolute answers to it. So this little bit here kind of encapsulates much of what the story itself is doing, with all its references and allusions to biblical and mythological characters, alerting us to the idea that this story is exploring something mysterious about human nature and human condition. But, as Captain Veer says, but what has a military court to do with it? Not to add that for us, any possible investigation of it is cut off by the lasting tongue tie of him in yonder. I'd be saying the only way we get any answers is we can't, because it's bottled up in the dead body in the other room. The prisoner's deed, with that alone we have to do. Because if what he is suggesting here, if we start looking into the mystery, we will never get answers, and then we will never be able to have a sense of absolute justice. And we need absolutes to meke out the kind of justice we have to consider here, which is a matter of life and death. So if we bring in that which is unknown, which is speculative, then we can never arrive at a consensus where we all agree with absolute certainty. And we can't function that way. Not in this society, in a military society, right, which is the ship is a microcosmic look at society as a whole, varying degrees. We're given an extreme example of society at a time of war on a gunship. But the principles are still there. It spills out beyond just the military into our whole societal functioning. Very much suggesting that if we don't follow it in this very rigid militaristic manner, how can we ever be sure that we are engaging in proper justice and matters of justice? If there's mystery involved, then we can never be certain. Just like the philosophers and the theologians, the psychologists and the artists never give absolute answers, or in some cases perhaps they do, but for the most part it is trying to explain the unexplainable. And how far can we go with that? But we can write up on the board 2 + 2 = 4. That we can all agree on. We need to keep this within similar parameters so that we can all agree absolutely this and this and this transpired. And therefore, according to the law, this must be what happens next. And we're going to remove from the discussion all that is mysterious. All right. So, there's so much here, but we've covered most of it. And again, the emphasis on martial law. Again, be attentive to it is nature, right? There's so much emphasis on natural human nature and natural behavior, right? Buttons that we are test to our allegiance is to nature, no to the king. So okay, we'll have to look at this a bit, and then I'll try to wrap up. The discussion here is about natural justice. Okay, let's go back to here. Okay, so now we get back to right. Captains who nevertheless would frankly concede that His Majesty's Navy would muster no more efficient officer in their grade than Starry Veer. Again, the emphasis on the efficiency of Captain Veer. What he said was to this effect, in his argument. Hitherto I have been but the witness, little more, and I should hardly think now to take another tone, that of your coadjutor. For the time did I not perceive in you, at the crisis too, a troubled hesitancy, proceeding, I doubt not, from the clash of military duty with moral scruple. Scruple vitalized by compassion. So here is Captain Veer saying, I've been here now as a witness. I'm the only witness to what transpired. But now I'm going to talk to you in a more intimate way in terms of understanding your position as jurors here. And what I'm recognizing in you is this, what he calls this troubled hesitancy on your part to proceed with this trial and render a verdict and carry out that verdict, execution. I recognize this hesitancy on you, troubled hesitancy. And the reason you're having this troubled hesitancy is because of this clash, this conflict. Remember, all these conflicts that are being explored in this story. The conflict or the clash between military duty, which in this story, in this situation, is representative of the society in which they are all coexisting as individuals, but within the ship on the Indomitable, which is this microcosmic representation of society. The clash of military duty with moral scruple, with your sense of morality, and your sense of compassion. Now, the suggestion here, because it's a clash and a conflict, is that in this society, this military society, this representation of society, there's no room for morality and compassion. Let's go on. For the compassion, how can I otherwise than share it? Veer's saying, I'm compassionate too. I share your sense of compassion for Billy, for all these reasons that are leading to your troubled hesitancy. But mindful of paramount obligations, I strive against scruples that may tend to enervate decision. If we get bogged down in compassion predicated on this unknown factor and the mystery and these other mitigating circumstances, we won't be able to make decisions. If we don't make decisions, then the machine breaks down. And we can't have the machine break down, because then it affects the entire society. Again, in an extreme circumstances that they're dealing with. If the machine breaks down and we have troubles on this ship, and when we do have troubles, we don't resolve them by making the right decisions right away, then we may be in battle at any time and we may all perish because of this breakdown. Not, gentlemen, that I hide from myself that the case is an exceptional one. Veer's acknowledging all this. It is an exceptional case. Speculatively regarded, it well might be referred to a jury of casuists, right? So where a jury where they would be seeking the causes that led to the situation. Everything that we were talking about, everything about, well, we have to talk about all these other circumstances, right? And there can be trials and juries like this in some societies. Certainly, we're expected to be having that in our society, right? But for us here acting not as causists or moralists, it is a case practical. And under martial law, practically to be dealt with. So this is so important to the story, right? I mean, again, we're in an extreme situation where the society that we are dealing with is a martial society at war, right? It comes back to that initial conflict between the individual and society. Don't forget, Billy initially is on the Rights of Man, a non-military ship, a merchant ship. And on that ship, if this had transpired, a jury and a court would be convened that might, and probably would, consider the circumstances. What the outcome would be, we can only speculate. But here, in an extreme portrayal and representation of that society, we have to be pragmatic and practical. We have no time to, ironically, do what we know Captain Vere likes to do, which is think things through. Starry Vere, standing up on, gazing out over the ocean, engaged in philosophical contemplations. Captain Vere knows about this way of approaching things. He recognizes that there is very few things that are 2 + 2 = 4, which gives his argument that much more power, in that he understands the oppositional position. He understands everyone who say, well, no, we have to take in, what are the causes of this? But in our environment, we can't do that. And I, Captain Vere, know better than most of you, maybe all of you, about what thinking about morality and psychology and causes, how important that is as a thinking person, as a natural part of our humanity. But in order to ensure that our society functions properly, sometimes we have to remove ourselves from that. Extraordinary statement, extraordinary approach. But your scruples, do they move as in a dusk? Challenge them. Make them advance and declare themselves. Come now, do they import something like this? If, mindless of palliating circumstances, we are bound to regard the death of the master at arms as the prisoner's deed, then does that deed constitute a capital crime whereof the penalty is a mortal one? What he's saying, hold on, if we approach this without allowing these scruples and uncertain contemplations that don't have absolutes, if we look at this without allowing ourselves to drift away from the purely pragmatic, what do we know? What is absolute here? Then does that deed constitute a capital crime whereof the penalty is a mortal, penalty is death? But in natural justice, is nothing but the prisoner's overt act to be considered? How can we adjudge to summary and shameful death a fellow creature innocent before God and whom we feel to be so? Does that state it aright? You sign sad assent. Well, I too feel that, the full force of that. It is nature. I understand what you're thinking, and I recognize it as I understand it. I feel it. It's natural for us to feel it. It's natural for us to feel compassion for Billy. It's natural for us to want to know the circumstances that led to this. But do these buttons that we wear, the buttons on their uniforms, attest that our allegiance is to nature? No. It's to the king. Now, of course, the implications here are tremendous. That the allegiance to the king trumps, overwhelms, surpasses our allegiance to nature, to our natural instincts. That we have to control our human nature. Subordinate our human nature, things of compassion, morality, ethics even perhaps. Subordinate it to our allegiance to the king, to the society, to the government. That is what's most important, because if we don't do that, then our society will not survive. Though the ocean, which is inviolate nature primeval, though this be the element where we move and have our being as sailors, yet as the king's officers lies our duty in a sphere correspondingly natural. So little is that true, that in receiving our commissions, we in the most important regard cease to be natural free agents. In relation to this particular part of the story, this whole ending, and that's why I'm focusing on this, because it really speaks to all the other things that we talked about in our last class. What his argument is saying, that in whence we received our commissions, once we took our oaths to serve the king, to serve the society, we cease to be natural free agents. We cease to be individuals. Our natural individuality is no longer relevant. Remember that initial conflict between the individual, the rights of man, and the functionality of a society. And of course, this is all dressed up, if you will, in this conflict between what we mean by natural free agents, where we have emotions and thoughts and desires that are not, that don't necessarily have a clear and progressive role in the functionality of our society. It's almost as if the society, especially in this extreme example of it, is a machine that has no place for emotions and compassion and all those things that are so essentially human. All those elements of being a human being that are mysterious. Ideas, love and emotions, which are confusing, that are hard to explain, that science can't explain, that is so particularly human. Comes back to what I've mentioned many times in class. This is where religion and philosophy and art come in to try to explore those elements of the human condition that cannot be explained by science. Right? Think of that chapter we talked about at length, a digression. Why was Billy's body, did it not twitch and act like it's supposed to act? Well, that's a mystery, says the scientist. Yes, well, how do you explain that mystery, Mr. Scientist? I can't. And now I got to go. Because there's no point in even talking about it. Because it can't be explained. And he even says to Mr. Percy, I know you're going to sit there and start thinking about it in metaphysical terms and religious terms and all this stuff. You do that. I'm the scientist. I don't deal with that. So I just ignore it? I mean, the point being that science cannot address these things. And a society, in order to function, cannot get bogged down in these things. Because it needs to make quick decisions, and it needs to be sure, at least in their minds, that the decisions are the correct ones. The decisions have to be 2 + 2 = 4. Billy killed Claggart. That's it. That's all we need to discuss. Forget all that stuff that surrounds it, because that stuff leads to mystery and uncertainty and all those elements of the human condition, which are, that don't have absolute understandings. We can't deal with those. And we as officers, upon receiving our commission, we had to put those elements of our as what we are as natural free agents. We are not natural free agents when we serve the society. And yes, again, this is an extreme version in the military, but the commentary incorporates all elements. Again, look at our current situation today. We, on some level, have to give up some of the qualities of us as natural free agents in order to function in our society here today in Montreal. You can't go out after 9:30. That is a limit that's placed on our freedom, our natural freedom. Why, if I want to go for a walk at midnight, why can't I? Well, you can't. You can't drive through a red light. Right? So we're all having to do what Captain Vere is suggesting be done here on some level. By using this story and bringing it into an extreme level, an exaggerated level perhaps, it shines a bolder light on it. Our job is to recognize how it actually has this universal quality, and we can recognize it in our own lives and in our own societies. Oops, get rid of this. All right. So I've been going on almost an hour here. But this is what I really wanted to focus on. And if you look at what I just discussed and put it into the context of what we've been discussing for the last 3 or 4 weeks, right, it should tie it in together nicely. All right. Got it. Okay. Keep in mind as well. I'm going to end up going on for hours and hours. And again, a lot of the stuff we've already discussed, so I don't want to be repetitive. But keep in mind this idea of the necessity of the law that is a law devised by the people within the society to ensure the functionality of that society. And of course, then we're meant to ask ourselves, why does Billy say, God bless Captain Vere right before his death? Is it in praise of Captain Vere's decision? Is it in a way of forgiving Captain Vere, suggesting that Captain Vere's decision is wrong? Why are the last words out of Captain Vere's mouth, Billy Budd, Billy Budd? How do we discuss that or understand that in relation to all the imagery associated with Billy, right? Very much the Christ imagery that we see here at his death and so on. We discussed this in class, but all the other allusions associated with Billy, from Adam to Apollo, right? Greek mythology, biblical references, both Hebrew Bible and New Testament references, really giving this element of a otherworldly quality to Billy, to Claggart to some extent as the serpent, referred to as such. Vere, not so much. Vere much more rooted in a very worldly, realistic, non-metaphysical imagery. Again, remember the triangle that I put up on the board a number of times. What does that all mean? Well, that's what you want. That's what we're asked to think about. We're not given a clear-cut answer. And one of the ways to approach this, one of the things to be thinking about in preparation for the exam, is what these things I just brought up. Why does he say, God bless Captain Vere? Why does Vere say, call out Billy's name? Is Captain Vere's argument convincing? And if so, why? Remember, he seems to be arguing you have to put aside your individual natures and move in a pragmatic and practical way. Why? To ensure that our society continues to function. Remember the name of the ship that they battle, the ship that ultimately leads to the death of Captain Vere, the French ship that they fight? It's called the Atheist. What are the suggestions of that? Is it suggested that since it is as a result of the confrontation with the atheist that Captain Vere ultimately dies? Is that some kind of commentary, some kind of suggestion that Vere's actions, by ignoring these mysterious qualities of human condition, are actions and behaviors that are not taking into account the idea of God and what God comes to represent, certainly in a Christian context, with the ideas of compassion and helping others? And Vere's argument in many respects is we have to do this to help everyone else in our community. Because if we don't, then we may have disruptions to this community. So we have to proceed in this very practical matter, following the rule of law, to demonstrate to everyone, all the individuals in our society, that we are in control and that we will continue to function mechanically almost. And don't any of you get any ideas of, lofty thinking that can then lead to a challenging of the restrictions that are imposed upon you. Remember, most of the men have been impressed into service. They are not there because they want to be there. They're not there because of their free will. They are forced to be there. Think about how all that intermixed into these questions of freedom, individual, natural sensibility, versus the sacrifices and restrictions we have to place on ourselves for the betterment and the functionality of the society within which we reside. We see again, we can't ignore, that's why I brought up the Atheist, the name of the ship, the French ship that is battled. We also saw the bit with the chaplain, how the chaplain realizes Billy doesn't understand what I'm trying to do to save him. It doesn't matter to Billy. Almost suggesting that that's not what's going to save Billy. Is this story a challenge to certain religious beliefs? All right. There's even the challenge here, right? When it comes to the chaplain, bluntly put, a chaplain is the minister of the Prince of Peace. Chaplain is the minister of the Prince of Peace. The Prince of Peace being Jesus. Okay? Remember, Billy is referred to as the peacemaker. But put bluntly, a chaplain is the minister of the Prince of Peace, serving in the host of the god of war, Mars. As such, he is as incongruous as a musket would be on the altar at Christmas. Bold, again, conflict. A chaplain is the minister of peace. What's he doing on a warship? The two don't go together, and yet we try to make them go together. How do we reconcile these contrasts? All right, I'm going to wrap it up there. Remember as well, because we discussed in class, that ultimately this whole story of Billy Budd becomes a myth into itself. We see the newspaper account of it, which utterly changes. It's not, doesn't even approximate what actually happened. The story is being told to us by a narrator very much in the future. So it's predicated on what? Memories of stories of people relating it to him, which puts the whole thing, the whole story, the events that transpired into question in terms of the details of exactly how everything transpired. How could he remember? How could he know all these details? Right? But it is the narrative. The story then takes on an allegorical and symbolic meaning. Just like the stories and the narratives in sacred texts. Are we meant to read them literally or allegorically, figuratively, as a way and means by which to discuss elements of the human condition and to help us try to determine the right way to live our lives? This story, because of the allusions and all these other elements of it, take on that same type of signification that so many of the narratives in the Bible take on. It has very realistic elements to it, but it's the message that is more often than not addressing an element of the mystery of life that is being explored. Something that we can't explore on a regular basis in our everyday world of our society, because the society has to function. How do we reconcile this? How do we maintain that natural individual mystery of compassion and emotions and morality and ethics, often differing from one individual to the other? How do we maintain that in its full integrity as individuals when we have to function in a society that has to keep moving and that is responsible for all the individuals? That's what's going on in every society. It always has been. We evolve, societies evolve, individuals evolve, and they try to reconcile where there is clashes and conflict. And sometimes, as Veer makes the argument, sometimes we have to make decisions where we have to put our morality and our compassion aside, because otherwise we can't function as a society. The machine will break down. How do we go about navigating between and through those conflicts? Is Captain Veer's the right way or not? And is Billy suggesting in his God Bless Captain Veer that he says, yeah, you did the right thing? Or is it more of just a sympathetic, compassionate gesture towards Captain Veer, feeling sorry for him because he had to make this decision, even though it's not the right one? Exemplified in his dying in a battle against a ship called the Atheist. All right, I'm going to end it there. I know we haven't talked about the Billy and the Darbies in any kind of detail. I think, you know, you can certainly explore it, and if you're answering a question on Billy Budd in the exam, draw on it. For me to go into that now, I think just would be getting too confusing. We would probably need another 2 weeks of discussions on Billy Budd. But I think we've covered a tremendous amount of ground on Billy Budd. And a lot there to be thinking about. And remember as well, there is a PowerPoint that is up on Omnivox to help guide you in terms of what you should be focusing on as you prepare for the exam. And that being said, we will see you on Thursday at the exam, and we'll take it from there.